All right. Ready to dive into a topic that, well, it's been in the headlines forever, it seems.
Yeah, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Definitely one of those things where everybody's heard about it.
Oh, absolutely.
It's
Yeah.
it's tough to really get a handle on it?
It can feel, honestly, overwhelming.
Oh, yeah.
All the history, the different perspectives, where you even begin.
Right.
So that's what we're here for, right? We're using this text, the conflict between Israel and Palestine, causes and background to kind of break it down.
Exactly.
And what's interesting is, even if you think you know the basics, this text, it brings up some things that I was like, didn't know that.
It's surprising how many layers there are to this, even for folks who think they've got a grasp on it.
Totally. So I guess to really make sense of what's happening now, we have to rewind a bit.
Big time. I mean, you can't just jump into the present day and expect to understand what's going on. The historical context it's everything.
So are we talking like way back, even before Israel as we know it existed?
Way back. Think Ottoman Empire.
Okay, wow. So centuries ago.
Yep, they control the territory up until World War I, actually.
That's a long time. So what happened? Did the Ottomans just like disappear?
Well, they collapsed. World War I kind of shuffled the whole deck in the region, and that's when the British stepped in. They took over administration under a League of Nations mandate.
Ah, okay. So the British come in, taking over from the Ottomans. But meanwhile, Zionism, the movement for a Jewish homeland, is gaining momentum.
Exactly, and that's a crucial piece of the puzzle. Jewish immigration starts picking up during this time, fueled by Zionism.
So you've got this land with existing Arab population and now an influx of Jewish immigrants. It's starting to sound like a pressure cooker already.
It definitely sets the stage for some serious tensions, that's for sure. Competing claims to the land, different cultures, different goals.
Right. And then, bam, 1947 hits, and the UN drops this bombshell, the partition plan.
Huge turning point. The UN basically tried to split the baby, so to speak.
So literally drawing lines on a map saying, okay, this is for the Jews, this is for the Arabs.
Basically, separate Jewish and Arab states with Jerusalem under international control, that was the idea.
And spoiler alert, it didn't go so smoothly, did it?
Not even close. I mean, you can imagine trying to impose this kind of division from the outside. It was bound to create issues. The Jewish leadership, they accepted the plan.
They saw it as a way to finally have their own state, right?
Yeah, a homeland they'd been striving for. But the Palestinian Arabs and the surrounding Arab states, they completely rejected it.
They saw it as unfair, I'm guessing. Like, wait a minute, this is our land too.
Exactly. They felt it ignored their own deep connection to the land, their history, their culture. And this rejection, well, pretty much sets the stage for the 1948 war.
And that's where things really explode, right? Israel declares independence, war breaks out, and then the Nakba.
Yeah, the Nakba, the catastrophe, it's a heavy term for a reason. It refers to the mass displacement of Palestinians during that period.
Hundreds of thousands of people forced from their homes. It's a part of history that, honestly, I think a lot of people don't fully grasp the scale of.
Around 700,000 Palestinians were displaced. To be more precise, think about the trauma, the families ripped apart, the loss.
It's hard to even imagine, and this is something that continues to shape the conflict even today, right?
Absolutely. The Nakba isn't just a past event, it's a living memory for Palestinians. It fuels their demands for justice, for a right of return.
And that right of return, that's a whole other can of worms, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it's a very complex issue, often misunderstood. It's not just about literally going back to homes that might not even exist anymore.
It's about, what, acknowledging the injustice, the loss?
Right. It's about the need for some kind of redress, recognition of what happened, and that demand, that feeling of injustice. It's central to understanding the Palestinian perspective and why this conflict is so difficult to resolve.
So the Nakba isn't just history, it's a wound that's still open. And then, just when you think things couldn't get more complicated, you have the 1967 Six-Day War.
Another major turning point. Israel ends up occupying a whole bunch of new territory. The West Bank, the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, even parts of the Sinai Peninsula.
Whoa, so their control expands significantly. What happens to those territories after the war?
Well, the Sinai Peninsula, that eventually gets returned to Egypt. But the other territories, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, those remain under Israeli control.
And that brings us to the whole issue of settlements, right?
Exactly. That's when you start seeing Israeli communities being established in the West Bank and East Jerusalem.
And that's a huge point of contention, I'm
It's
guessing.
huge. Imagine from the Palestinian perspective, you're talking about land that they see as theirs for a future state.
And now there are these settlements popping up, making that future state less and less viable.
Right. So you've got this constant source of friction, these settlements that Palestinians see as encroaching on their land, undermining their right to self-determination. It's one of the
Right.
biggest obstacles to peace.
So it's not just about historical claims or drawing lines on a map, it's about the reality on the ground. These settlements change the game completely.
Totally. They're a physical manifestation of the conflict, a constant reminder of the power imbalance and the unresolved issues.
And it's not just about land and borders, right? We have to talk about the different Palestinian movements, the factions within the Palestinian community. They each have their own goals and strategies.
Yeah, you can't just talk about the Palestinians as one monolithic group. It's way more nuanced than that.
Right, because before the break, we started to touch on the PLO, and then there's Hamas, and they seem to have very different approaches.
They do. The Palestinian political landscape is, well, it's complicated. You've got groups with very different ideologies, different histories, different visions for the future.
So before we get into the specifics of those groups, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll unpack the different factions within the Palestinian movement and how they impact the quest for peace. You know, it's easy to get caught up in all the politics and the history, the back and forth, but we're talking about real people's lives here.
Absolutely. The human side of this conflict often gets lost in the headlines.
Right. So let's try to bring that to the forefront. Like, what's it actually like for people living this conflict every day?
It's tough for everyone involved.
Mhm.
Take Palestinians in the West Bank, for example. Their lives are often defined by checkpoints, by restrictions on their movement.
It's like they're constantly having to prove they belong there, even in their own land.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And economically, it's really hard. Limited access to jobs, to resources, even basic necessities can be a struggle.
And on the Israeli side, I mean, security has to be a huge concern, right?
Oh, absolutely. The fear of attacks, of violence, it's always there. It shapes everything, where you live, how you raise your kids.
It's like living with this constant underlying anxiety, I imagine.
Exactly. It permeates every aspect of society. And then, within the Palestinian community itself, you have these different factions, different political groups.
Right. That's what we were getting at before the break. Like, it's not a monolith, is it?
Nope, not at all. The PLO, for example, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, they started out advocating for armed struggle against Israel.
So a very, very different approach from what we often hear about today, right?
Right. But over time, things changed. Their stance evolved.
What led to that shift? I mean, going from armed struggle to what? Advocating for a negotiated settlement? That's a pretty dramatic change.
It was a gradual process. Internal debates within the PLO, the changing political landscape globally, the realization that a military victory was just not realistic.
So they eventually recognized Israel's right to exist and started pushing for a two-state solution.
Exactly. But then you've got Hamas, which emerged in the late 80s, and they took control of the Gaza Strip back in 2006. And their perspective is very different.
More hardline, right. I mean, from what I understand, they don't even recognize Israel's right to exist at all.
That's right. They represent a more Islamist viewpoint,
Mm-hmm.
and they continue to engage in armed conflict with Israel.
So even within the Palestinian movement, there's this huge divide. Some wanting to negotiate a two-state solution, others rejecting Israel entirely.
Yep. And that makes finding a path to peace, well, even harder. Because Israel is dealing with not just one unified entity, but with these different factions, each with their own agenda.
Talk about adding another set of complexity. And then, of course, you can't forget about the international community. We talked about the U.S. and the EU, but what about the UN? They've been involved in this conflict for, well, forever, it seems.
Since the very beginning, pretty much.
Yeah.
Remember that 1947 partition plan? That was the UN. And they're still active today, providing humanitarian aid, monitoring human rights.
Trying to keep things from boiling over completely, I guess.
Trying to, yeah. They also try to facilitate negotiations between the two sides.
But that's got to be tough, right? I mean, just having good intentions doesn't magically solve a conflict like this.
Definitely not. The UN has limitations. They can't really enforce their resolutions. And then you have all the political divisions within the UN itself.
Which probably reflect all the geopolitical stuff going on in the world at large.
Exactly. It's like a microcosm of global politics.
So the UN's walking a tightrope. And what about other regional powers? Do they play a role in all this?
The Arab world's relationship with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, well, it's changed a lot over time. Early on, there was a lot of hostility towards Israel, strong support for the Palestinians.
I mean, that makes sense given the shared history and religion and all that.
Yeah, for sure. But in recent years, there's been a noticeable shift. Some Arab countries have started normalizing relations with Israel.
Really? That's kind of surprising, isn't it?
It is. It's driven by a lot of factors. Shared security concerns about Iran, economic interests, and also some Arab leaders have kind of acknowledged that the old approach of isolating Israel hasn't really helped the Palestinians much either.
So it's kind of a mixed bag, I guess. Some Arab countries are forging these new ties with Israel, while others are maybe not so happy about it.
Right. It adds another layer of complexity to an already incredibly complex situation.
But even with all these external players, all these shifting alliances, it ultimately comes down to the Israelis and the Palestinians themselves, right? They have to be the ones to find a way forward.
Absolutely. No one can impose peace from the outside. It has to come from within. Both sides need to acknowledge each other's legitimate concerns, make tough compromises, and choose reconciliation over continued conflict.
Easier said than done, I'm sure. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I gotta ask, is there any room for optimism here? Amidst all this complexity and all the challenges, is there any hope for a peaceful resolution?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The current situation, it might look bleak, but history is full of surprises. What seems impossible today can change overnight. And even if a grand peace agreement feels far off, there are things that can be done to make things better right now.
So even if a final resolution isn't on the horizon, there are steps that can be taken to at least improve the situation, to build some trust.
Exactly. And those steps, they matter. They can create a more hopeful future, even if it's just a little bit at a time.
So tell us, what are those steps? What can be done to move the needle, even if it's just a little bit?
Well, we've definitely covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From the historical roots of this conflict to the impact it has on people's daily lives, to the role of the international community. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. But I think it's crucial to understand those complexities before we can even start talking about solutions.
Right, context is key. So let's talk solutions.
Yeah.
I mean, is there even a solution? That's the big question, isn't it? And I think it's important to be realistic. There's no, like, magic wand we can wave to make this conflict disappear.
Okay, no quick fixes. But there have to be some ideas out there, right? Some frameworks, approaches that people have proposed over the years.
Of course. The two-state solution is probably the most familiar one. The idea is to have an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel, both recognizing each other's right to exist.
Sounds simple enough on paper. Two peoples, two states, everyone's happy. But I'm guessing it's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, the devil's in the details. Things like, where exactly do you draw the borders? What about Jerusalem? What about security for both sides? And then there's the whole issue of Palestinian refugees and the right of return.
Okay, so let's break those down a bit. Borders, for example. How do you even begin to draw a line that everyone agrees on, especially after decades of settlements being built?
Well, a lot of people point to the 1967 lines, the ones that existed before the Six-Day War. But, Israel has built settlements in the West Bank since then.
Right, so going back to those pre-1967 borders, it's not so simple anymore.
Not at all. And then you have Jerusalem, which is, well, that's a whole other level of complicated.
A city sacred to three major religions, claimed by both Israelis and Palestinians as their capital. How do you even begin to solve that puzzle?
It's maybe the most sensitive issue in the whole conflict. You're talking about deep religious and historical significance for both sides.
Right. So finding a solution that respects those things while also addressing the political realities, it sounds almost impossible.
It's definitely one of the biggest challenges. And then, of course, you have the security concerns for both Israelis and Palestinians, the refugee question, the fact that there's just so much mistrust built up over decades of conflict.
Honestly, it can feel overwhelming just thinking about it.
It is a lot. But, history is full of examples of seemingly intractable conflicts that eventually got resolved.
So you're saying there's still hope, even in this case?
I think so. What it takes is, well, political will from leaders on both sides, a real commitment to peace, and sometimes pressure from the international community can play a role too.
So we've talked about the two-state solution, but are there other ideas being floated around out there?
There are. Some people advocate for a one-state solution.
A one-state solution? What, like everyone just lives together in one big, happy state?
Well, the idea is that you'd have one state where Israelis and Palestinians would have equal rights as citizens.
Hmm, that sounds pretty radical. I mean, a complete departure from how things are now.
It is, and it's very controversial. The people who support it, they argue it's the only way to achieve true equality and justice for everyone.
Because they see the current situation as inherently unequal, I guess.
Right. But there are a lot of people who strongly oppose a one-state solution.
Because?
Well, they worry it would lead to even more chaos, more violence. They question whether two groups with such a long history of conflict could actually coexist peacefully in one state.
So it's not exactly a simple solution either.
No, it's definitely not a simple solution. And realistically, neither the two-state or the one-state solution seems likely to happen anytime soon. So the question becomes, what can we do in the meantime?
Yeah. What can be done to at least make things better, to move towards a more peaceful future, even if a final solution feels far off?
There are things that can be done. For example, the situation in Gaza, it's a humanitarian crisis. Easing the blockade, improving living conditions, creating economic opportunities.
So basically giving people a reason to hope.
Exactly. Because when people feel hopeless, that's when extremism can take root and violence becomes more likely.
Makes sense. What else?
Stopping the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank is another big one. Many people see the settlements as the biggest obstacle to peace.
Because they're essentially creating facts on the ground, making a two-state solution harder and harder to achieve, right?
Right. And they're a constant source of tension between Israelis and Palestinians. So those are some things that could be done in the short term, kind of immediate steps to improve the situation.
Okay, so what about the long game? How do you actually change the mindset, bridge the divide that's existed for so long?
That's the real challenge. It requires, I think, a fundamental shift in the narrative, moving away from this idea that it's a zero-sum game, where one side wins and the other loses.
So instead of seeing each other as the enemy, you're saying they need to start seeing a shared future.
Yeah, it's a big ask, I know, especially given all the history we've talked about.
It sounds incredibly difficult.
It is. But I think it starts with supporting those grassroots efforts that are already happening. People working to promote dialogue, empathy, understanding. There are organizations doing amazing work to build bridges between communities, to challenge the narratives of fear and hatred that exist on both sides.
So it's a long-term project, maybe even a generational shift in thinking.
It probably is.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to hold on to hope.
Yeah, without hope, what's the point, right?
Exactly. This conflict has caused so much suffering. It demands that we at least try to find a better way.
Well said. This has been a really, I don't know, a heavy conversation, but an important one. And I think as we wrap up our deep dive into this conflict, it's important to remember that there are people working for peace, even if we don't always hear about them in the news. They're out there building bridges, promoting understanding, trying to create a better future.
Absolutely. And those efforts, they matter. They're what give me hope.
Me too. So to our listeners, we encourage you to keep learning, to keep engaging with this issue. Don't let the headlines get you down. There are glimmers of hope out there, and it's up to all of us to keep that hope alive. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep diving deep.